Welcome. I'm Dr. Megan Clark, and I welcome everyone on behalf of our St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee for this conversation. We will begin as we always do in a minute with prayer, but just a little housekeeping. Everyone, please keep your video and mics off unless you are on the panel. And if you have, we will get to a point where we will take questions from the audience. Please put that into the chat, and I will read out questions from there when it comes time. We are in a precarious moment in which there is a lot of uncertainty. We're in a moment where there is a intentional mass deportation campaign as its stated goal, where just last week, 25% of students at Greenport, schools out on Long Island stayed home after there was rumored indication that there was ICE activity in the area. For those who don't know the area, that is the center of this area out on Long Island's farming community with a lot of farm workers and farm worker families. We don't know how many students and families are not leaving their houses and not going to school in New York City public schools, because that doesn't get released regularly. And so as we seek to better understand kind of who is afraid and why, who is vulnerable and why, and what we might be able to do to more in justice and solidarity, be neighbors to those who are affected right now and advocates and allies. We begin first, as we always do, by taking a moment for prayer. And I am taking this evening our prayer for migrants and refugees from Catholic Relief Services. Lord God, thank you for allowing us to spend this time with you and in solidarity with our sisters and brothers on the move around the world. Please open our minds that we may better understand the plight of those who have been forced to migrate or flee their homes. Open our hearts so we may be moved to compassion and action to support those who seek safety and opportunity, those who may be living next door in our community now. We pray this in your name, O Lord. Amen. I am very excited for our panelists this evening. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll get our conversation started. We have with us Mario Russell, who is a longtime partner and friend and member of the St. John's community, who is the executive director of the Center for Migration Studies here in New York City. He is an attorney and professor with over 25 years' experience in migration policy and law. He's lectured and presented extensively, served on various state, city, and federal immigration policy and practice committees. Before joining CMS, he was director of the Immigrant and Refugee Services section or division of Catholic Charities in New York, where he oversaw legal, resettlement, asylum, unaccompanied minors, and day laborer services. He conducted litigation in the federal district and appeals courts and managed the Asylum Defense Clinic at St. John's University's Law School. He also has previously worked as regional director for Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Inc., which is called Clinic. Ralph Tomasant Joseph is an award-winning multimedia journalist based in New York. He's been a journalist for more than 10 years. More originally from Haiti, he co-created the news section of Ayebo Post, one of the most competitive Haitian digital media, and has been editor-in-chief there for 3 years. He is currently at Documented New York as the Caribbean Communities correspondent. He has a master's degree in digital journalism from NYU, studied law and sociology at the Haitian State University, and is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. Sering Lama is the Senior Manager of Organizing and Policy at Adhikar. Adhikar was one of the community organizations that was, I apologize, that was noted and at our Vincentian convocation for social justice this fall. Sering joined Adhikar as a volunteer English for Empowerment facilitator in 2014 and began working as a domestic worker organizer in 2016, then transitioned into policy manager. In her 7+ years of working at Adhikar, Sering has led programs related to workforce development for domestic workers in New York and New Jersey, adult literacy programs with English classes, digital literacy, and citizenship preparation classes. As an organizer, she led base building for workers' campaigns in New Jersey and helped introduce the New Jersey Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. Sering is also a trained interpreter and has supported Adhikar members as caseworkers, as well as worked with various other organizations and government offices as an interpreter. In her role as policy manager, she supports each program area at Adhikar in their policy needs. She is a Tibetan immigrant from Nepal, a CUNY alum. Sering holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in labor studies. We are most honored to have all of you with us today. And as we get started, I want to ask each of you with this first question to introduce yourself a little bit more and say anything you would wish to say about the organization you work for, and then address my question. So I'm going to start with you, Mario. As an immigration lawyer, professor, and advocate, you've been engaged on the issue for decades. We hear people throwing their hands up, saying, our immigration system is broken, as if there is nothing to be done. The government claims to be targeting criminals and those here illegally, and yet many being detained by ICE and targeted right now have authorization to be here. Many have work authorization and are engaged in a legal process. I know it is a big ask, but can you briefly lay out where we are in this moment and a little bit about how we got here?
Well, thank you, Megan. Anytime you ask a lawyer to be brief, you're going to have you're in trouble already. But thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me tonight. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to join with Sering and Ralph. Good to see you, Ralph, again, and Sering, meeting you for the first time. I just want to say I have a great affinity for the Vincentian life and culture. And it was actually in 1988, and I want to be clear, not 1888, but 1988, when I graduated from college. And I volunteered for a year with the Vincentian Service Corps. And that's really how I had an exposure to the phenomenon of migration in America. I worked with about 400 or 500 laborers in New Jersey at Catholic Charities in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, processing them for this thing that existed at the time called amnesty, which was a piece of legislation, of course, passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law at the time by America's then most famous Republican President, Ronald Reagan. The Amnesty Act, legalization, which legalized some 3+ million people who had to prove that they had entered without authorization and had resided in the United States for 5 years without permission. So working with and through the Vincentian Service Corps, which is a volunteer program for young graduates, I had this experience of seeing the power of law and, of course, service and of Catholic social teaching and Vincentian values, all in this experience that was absolutely transformative. What I didn't know was that was probably the best and last and only thing that I would see in my entire career in terms of immigration law and policy. We've been on a painful downward trajectory for the last 40 plus years. And I think hitting today, of course, as you say, Megan, very clearly, a low of pain and anxiety that I've never seen, of course, before. In my years at Catholic Charities, I, of course, worked on 1,000 or more asylum cases, reunification of families, and saw what I thought was sort of the regular cadence of the American migrant experience, whether it was through work, family, or protection. But now, obviously, we're in a completely different era of protection and defense. So the Center for Migration Studies is a Catholic identified think tank that promotes just and compassionate policies. And our theory, our sort of theory of change, if you will, or our center of gravity is the person, human dignity. And of course, we believe in security. Of course, we believe in economics and labor. Of course, we understand the importance of crimes and social systems and benefits. And those are all kinds of theories that might govern other think tanks. Our starting point is the person, the human person, of course, by extension, the family and the worker. And do policies dignify that inherent human value? So it's been my honor and privilege to be at CMS now for 2.5 years, taking a slightly broader view on the question of migration, which I otherwise had kind of on the ground for 25 years or so at Catholic Charities. And to answer your question, Megan, I will try to be brief, and if I'm going too long, just give me a signal. I'm not, easily offended. But let me just say this by way of introduction. And I think what you're asking me to do is to sort of give a little bit of a synopsis of how the system is kind of working or not working, and how we are ending up now in a place of policy that seems to be focused on expulsion, right? There are really two theories, if you think of the movement of human beings with respect to a nation state. And one is exclusion, who can come in or who can't come in, and then who gets pushed out. So exclusion and expulsion are sort of the dynamic forces that I envision. And I want to say this, though, prefatory, if you'll permit, is that what's playing out now is really ultimately a long-held agenda about color, culture, custom, and the composition of America. It's not about legality or illegality. Whether someone is legal or illegal is really become a proxy, a fig leaf, a stalking horse to cover another agenda, which is the one I mentioned, which comes out of the White House and more specifically out of Stephen Miller's thinking. So it's not about crimes. It's not about security. It's not about abuse of public benefits. And it's even not about, I would submit, the economy or the competition over jobs. It's about color, culture, custom, and composition. And these otherwise ideas about security, about invasion, about crimes are really put in service with false and misleading information of this other agenda, which is dressed up, if you will, with the sense of law and order claims. But ultimately, it's really something else that's happening because the facts do not support the question of too much crime, too much threats to security, too much abuse of public benefits, and so on. The facts do not support. So you need to create misfacts, misinformation. And I'll say this, the administration has been incredibly effective in doing that. So the real question is, how do we respond? How do we restore dignity? How do we reform the system? That may take 5-10 years in a time of what I would call moral convulsion. We're in a time of moral convulsion. And that may be, in a sense, an opportunity. But a couple of things for facts and background. A, is there an invasion? No. America has always had about the same percentage makeup of foreign-born for the last 100 or more years. Always between 11 or so and 13, 14%. In 1910, America's foreign-born population was 15%. It went down to about 5 to 7 or so percent in 1970, and today it's at about 14.5%. So as a proportion of population, that's never really changed. So where do people come from, and how do they enter this system? The system that sort of, in a sense, permits or doesn't allow for this foreign-born population to be American with a capital C or a lowercase c is really through what's called the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is a system that I would call, for the most part today, inefficient, under-resourced, and uncoordinated. I don't think it's broken. It's just not the right system for the day. So when we talk about fixing the immigration system, we're really saying we need to kind of rebuild it, reimagine it. About 1 million or so green card permits are issued each year through the Immigration and Nationality Act system. Now, what's key here to understand is that it's a very narrow, limited, sort of tightly laned system. There are only 3 ways in which one can get residence through the INA. One is through family, which is fairly narrowly defined. That's about 58% of those 1 million permits are obtained through family. 2 is through work, about 27%. And then 3 is through what I call protection or other. And that's about 15%. When we say protection, I mean things like asylum, T's and U visas, special immigrant juvenile visa, and a few others. But it's not really a big proportion of the overall system, which is, as I said, inefficient, under-resourced, and really not internally coordinated, so that it takes years to process and adjudicate cases, literally 5, 7, 10, even sometimes 15 years, whether it's through an application or through the court system. People and families are separated during that time. People live in limbo, uncertain of their future while they grow roots. And it's a system that doesn't provide for temporary needs, even American temporary needs, such as labor, right? Workflow. So over the years, a system that couldn't really keep up with the actual needs of human beings on the move, who didn't necessarily always want to stay permanently, the executive branch, which is to say the president, now whether it was Bush, Clinton, Obama, and now Trump, were able to exercise a certain amount of power without legislative, if you will, authority or approval, creating modes of protection or modes of temporary care for certain kinds of populations that they could just do with a stroke of the pen, such as DACA, the Dreamers, such as temporary protected status for a host of countries who are experiencing, right, sort of, national strife or economic strife or certain natural disasters. Asylum, of course. Now, not to say that they could enter the asylum system with a stroke of the pen, but they would be given access to it through other programs that the president would say, yeah, you can come in the country with what? Humanitarian parole. We'll let you in, and then you can apply for asylum. Or the Ukrainians, remember them? They came many years ago. Afghans, right? Venezuelans, right? All sorts of parole what's called parole. It's kind of a funny concept because parole, you think of letting somebody out of prison. Well, parole in this case is the opposite. We let you in, right, for a temporary period of time, again, with the stroke of the president's pen. And so over the years, that's been used as a way of dealing with a system that otherwise is too narrow, too limited, too constrained, and not meeting the needs of the moment, the humanitarian needs and other needs. So now you've got about 6 or more million people who over the years have become part of American community, society, culture, whatever, right, in different parts of the country through these different, types of temporary authorization. And as a result, among the many results that keep being created as a function of a system that's dead and defunct and doesn't work, right, is a backlog, as I mentioned, overstays of visa, more executive actions. But I want to focus on two outcomes. I should say I'm going to focus on one. I'm going to mention two, though. Two outcomes that result from this phenomenon. One is, I've already mentioned, is the increase in the undocumented population. Right? The undocumented population continues to grow, not precipitously. So whatever Rubio says, and I know we're on the record here, but I'll say he's wrong. There aren't 30 million. I'm going to say, raise your hand if you know how many undocumented there are. Well, the number is probably closer to 14 million. And about 2-3 years ago, it was about 10 million by our count. We do a report every year on the undocumented. And then two is, right, people come and present themselves at the border seeking regularization. I'm fleeing problems in Venezuela, El Salvador, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Honduras, you name it, right? There are problems, climate change, gender abuse, all sorts of things. They present themselves at the border, and as a result, to some extent, you either say, shut the border, as Trump has done now, so nobody gets in, or, as President Biden said, yes, we'll give you humanitarian parole, you can come in, yes, you're from Ukraine, yes, you're from Venezuela, or CHNV, if that sounds familiar, right? Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuela program. There were safe mobility offices. So there are other things that Biden was doing at the time to allow people to access, if you will, the border and present for regularization. Now, the board is a whole other question. We're going to do that another day. And I think it needs its own policies and management, questions of the future about flow, questions about justice, questions about international law, economics, and ultimately morality. But to focus on the undocumented, because that's where we're talking about mass deportation. We have 14 million undocumented. Now, you heard it a minute ago, 6+ million of whom are what? Authorized. They were given authorization to stay. So even to call all those undocumented or illegal is dangerous, is rhetorical, is undermining, right, is dehumanizing, and is de-dignifying. So that's a fundamental problem of language. And as I said, it goes to the question of legality and illegality, which is, I think we need to remember always, a bit of a cover for a different agenda. And I think that probably the Super Bowl show last night made the point very clear, right? And very eloquently in its own way, I think. But what's really important, right? 14 million people who are undocumented, half of whom basically have temporary authorized status, 50% have been in the United States for 10 years or more, right? They are people who have built, contributed, created the United States. And the question of mass deportation then becomes both one of policy and morality. So what is mass deportation? Mass deportation under the current scheme is driven and designed by numbers. It's an outcome-driven policy. 3,000 arrests a day. And because you cannot arrest 3,000 criminals a day, because there aren't 3,000 criminals a day. In fact, Robert Reich, the ex-labor secretary, made a very funny comment, which, by the way, is humor and tragedy. He said, I don't understand why ICE goes looking for criminals at Home Depot. Right? Those are workers. And in a sense, ICE itself is telegraphing the fact that there aren't criminals that it's going after, right? But that's the language, that's the rhetoric. And that's, again, the narrative doesn't meet the reality. So now ICE and the executive have changed the narrative to say, well, when we talk about criminals, Yeah, Trump said murderers, rapists, and quote, the worst of the worst. Well, they've run out of those. In fact, Obama had, in a sense, deported many of those himself, as you well know. So now what we're seeing is the use of what? Illegal entry, well, of course, or traffic violations, or old convictions, or low level misdemeanors as a basis for tagging people as criminals. By the way, they say they deported 622,000, and recent data shows that even a third of those, in and of itself, a third of those have been acknowledged to have no criminal convictions, not even of the lowest that I just mentioned. So it's created a policy of sweeping and targeting en masse folks. So that's how we end up with mass deportation as a really kind of uh, policy to bring the concept of border enforcement into the interior, but against a population who fundamentally is of a different color, custom, culture, and composition. And I think begs an important question and an important awareness on our part. It's not a question of legality and illegality. And even if you assume that you look at the question of those who've been here without any kind of temporary authorization, there's a profound and important question to say, what's the right thing to do with people who've been here for 10 plus years, who have built, created, developed, and born into roots, church, community, maybe their homeown, right? They've become lowercase citizens. And I think that it demands an important question because at the end of the day, we can be rational about it. And that's important, but there's also a moral component. I'll say one last thing, Megan. There's an interesting, there's an interesting Fox News poll that was done in 2024. 5 questions about, quote, illegal aliens. That's the language it used. And it said, should illegal aliens be deported? 67% said yes. And question 4 was, should illegal aliens who have work have a pathway to citizenship? 64% said yes. I think that's really interesting. I think the American public and ourselves hold both ideas. We just need to marry those better. I think we're prepared to do that, but one side of that argument is winning the day, which is a question about legality, illegality, rule of law. The other piece is missing, but I think we can get there.
Thank you, Mario. It when we all see these surveys, right? We see the surveys in which that you're not really the cognitive dissonance between answers is frequently remarkable. But I also think that what we are seeing now is as you um the gap is being made more clear as people are watching their neighbors who at the end of the day they don't really care what their migration, right? What their papers are or aren't, what their migration status is, because they've lived next door to them for 5 years. They've bought tacos from the truck outside of their work for the last 2 years, right? They know them. They don't, it isn't who they see as a threat because they know they're not a threat. They know they're their neighbor, they're their friend. And and so it is, but this changing shift. And here's where I'm gonna turn to Saring. Adhikar is a women-led community organizing and worker center in Queens, organizing Nepali and South Asian communities. And as we heard from your bio, workers' rights and immigrants' rights go hand in hand in our core areas for you. Um, how has that work changed in this current moment with this administration's goal of mass deportation and increasing action by ICE and the Department of Homeland Security? How have you noticed it change, and how has the work and the advocacy of Adhikar had to change with it?
Yeah, thank you, Megan, and thank you for having me here today. As Adhikar, so I want to make it clear when we say we serve the Nepali speaking community for which we provide direct services, and we also do community organizing, community building for issues like workers' rights and immigrant justice, right? In there, I'll just kind of give you an example of how this administration impacted the community. It started with the termination of TPS for Nepal in the beginning of last year. Then we saw the pause of any asylum cases for many countries. So all the countries that we serve, when we say Nepali speaking, sorry, I'll go back. We mean people from Nepal, from India, from Tibet, from Bhutan, from Burma, right? So it represents various countries that have Nepali speaking as a common language. And when the asylum decision pause happened, it impacted all of those countries as well. In addition to that, we also saw that the visa bond, I think 38 countries were selected for that to be tested, where if you were to get any non-immigrant visa, you have to be able to pay up to five to $10,000 to come in, right? And you only get it back when you come back, right? So that was something that was recently, I would say, impacted. And then recently, just about January, for Nepal specifically, was part of 75 countries where any non-immigrant visa was paused, right? It was part of the suspension of the visa pause that happened for non-immigrant visas. So you can see how our community was impacted by various policy changes that happened this year. And what that did was initially, it was very traumatizing for our community, right? And we saw the need for like many immigrant organizations that serve immigrant communities, we saw the need for a higher demand for our case management. So we had to shift our priorities from a lot of the advocacy and organizing work to really expand our service work. So we started ramping up our legal service. We started ramping up our know your rights education, rapid response, building out a rapid response network. Through a Queen Center, like we did know your rights training in the beginning of the year in February, right? That's how early we started. As soon as the administration went into being in the office, we started doing know your rights training. And we also like connected with our legal networks to provide, with community lawyers to do like referrals because there wasn't a lot of legal organizations that had capacity. So we had to build external networks to build out that referral system. So it was like managing a lot of fear as well as like trying to support the community in any kind of immediate need that was needed. I think we had to slowly get back into the organizing work and really kind of get back into the advocacy where in that phase as well, a lot of our focus was it was more focused around the defensive work, right? How do we protect our community? So we focused a lot on building out our rapid response network. And as we're seeing a lot of other organizations growing that neighborhood by neighborhood, I think ICE out of NYC, there's a lot of like great networks of orgs that have been doing neighborhood building and neighborhood rapid response network. We have been able to kind of tap into that and connect our community members to like be part of that, right? So I think that's been really powerful to see in addition to like everything that was going on. Obviously, besides that, we've also been in the advocacy front, not just kind of been, we've been like in the forefront of fighting for TPS. So that's been a really important part. And we've been supporting through like coalition building and doing like advocacy with the coalitions, right? There is a litigation right now that is being led by NTPSA for the termination of TPS for Nepal. So we've been supporting efforts like that, right? And we've been having meetings with members of Congress so that they don't forget TPS, right? TPS, I mean, there's DACA. I know we have other organizations that work with CNHV programs. So we are a big coalition of immigrant advocates that have been making sure that whenever there is an opportunity for any kind of reform, these statuses and these people in these different statuses don't get forgotten. So that's been our main focus right now, and it will continue to be, I think, moving forward.
Thank you. Um, since you raised TPS, as I turn to you, Ralph, I mean, temporary protected status, right, is a humanitarian-based immigration status that allows people to live and work in the US. And temporary is a funny thing, as we have seen. It it actually, right, it has turned into, it really is a long-term reality. Um, and particularly in the cases of Haiti, Venezuela, Cuba, El Salvador, and many others, Nepal, um, these are all countries this administration has a Haiti, Venezuela, Cuba, and El Salvador are all recent attempts to terminate TPS. Even when it comes to Nepal, there's a limbo in terms of, but most recently, in terms of Haiti, on February 2nd, a federal judge said, no, you can't, pausing, but everybody is in limbo. And we're talking about 350,000 Haitians living and working throughout the United States. And it was really quite scary to put that next to reports of increased activity in Ohio, where the Haitian community during the campaign had been viciously targeted in ways that led to violence against them, claiming horrific, you talk about culture claims that Mario mentioned before, things I will not repeat. And so it really did seem as if you were talking about a kind of ramp up so that the second that TBS is withdrawn, they could start rounding people up and try in an effort to meet these arrest numbers. And so there's a pause because the federal judge stopped, but it is whether it's Haiti or Venezuela or El Salvador or even Nepal, everything is in kind of flux. Ralph, as a journalist, and you're right, as a journalist and an immigrant who's been reporting on this stuff for years, as well as your own experience, what are you seeing within the Caribbean communities in New York that you report on, but also the way that you are seeing in particular in this last week with respect to the TPS, both the ramp up to fear that it might go away, and now this particular, at least pause, but which highlights that all the uncertainty that's built into the system itself, as Mario noted in the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Megan. It's a great pleasure to be with you, to share this panel with you. So let me start by saying for the past 4 years, I've been covering the Caribbean community for Documented. So Documented is the only news outlet so far in New York focusing on immigrants and the policies that affect them. So we have multiple verticals. So we call them verticals. So I'm responsible for the Caribbean vertical. So we publish news content in 4 different languages: Spanish, Haitian, Creole, English, and Chinese. So as part of my responsibility as the Caribbean community correspondent, I have to develop a permanent two-way conversation with community leaders, with organizations, with different immigrant groups. And I've been also pushing content on Nextdoor for the past 3 years because based on a survey we conducted a couple years ago, we discovered that many people, especially Caribbean people, when it comes to have access to news, to what's happening in their community, they have, they reach out to Nextdoor. So based on my experience covering the Caribbean community in New York and pushing content on Nextdoor on social media and participating in different community events across the city, I can tell you that, there's a mix of everything, because most of the time when we talk about immigration, we tend to see the tragedies. So it's a mosaic, it's a mosaic of everything. So at first, I can tell you, I've seen stories of people who came here to the United States for decades, who have been living here, who have children here. They launch businesses. They've established themselves. Many have succeeded. They have, they're still living the American dream, but they feel like, there's a kind of approach, especially in the media, when it comes to cover this community, those immigrant community. The media come always when there's a crime or something bad happening, but they don't tell the story of, immigrants who are creating jobs, who work as nurses, as doctors, as restaurant owners, as, nannies, you name it. So the Caribbean people here, they feel like, they're not well represented in the media. And this create a problem because when US citizen need to understand immigration, it's not through crime, but through what immigrants have been doing, for decades or for century in the United States. For example, during COVID-19, people understood how important that workforce was for the American people. And every day people see their food are being delivered. You see all the delivery workers in New York, they're basically immigrants. So there's a need in the Caribbean community to see those kind of stories in the media. So I've also seen tragedies. I've reported many stories of people who have problem with the immigration system. So I've reported stories of people who self-deported since Trump came to power. I've also seen manifestation of solidarity from different organizations. Steering, I've been talking about, what her organization is doing specifically. I've seen so many things like that. People who volunteered, who show up for immigrants. I've seen, I've reported the stories of advocates. I've reported the stories of naturalized immigrants who are involved in politics. So their voices, have different type of impact. But I can tell you, since Donald Trump came back to power, most of the stories we reported and documented are mostly about fears. And there are many families who don't send their kids. Many kids don't show up to school because, out of fear of deportation. We have seen, many stories of family separation because it's really hard, especially when you have people who came here for the past 10 years and they're undocumented, but they have kids, they have children born here in the United States, and their kids went to school in the United States, and their kids have never been in their parents' country. And at some point, those parents, they have to make a choice. And the better choice is to leave their kids here and go back to their home countries. So we've covered such stories. And I've seen also the impact of fake news, of misinformation, especially on a platform like Nextdoor, where people are pushing all kind of misinformation, distorted views about immigrants. And I've seen the impact of the narrative that immigrants are here, they are criminals. I've seen how people immediately assimilate undocumented to criminal. And I've seen how hard it is to make people accept the fact that, many people who are on special humanitarian parole status, they contribute to the US economy. I've seen how hard it is to make people understand many of these immigrants, they are workers, they have jobs, they pay taxes, etc. So it's a mix of everything. Now, when it comes to the temporary protected status, you mentioned especially Haiti. I've published many pieces about the TPS, especially for Haiti. For context, Haiti has been designated for the first time for TPS in 2010 after an earthquake destroyed Haiti. So it was under President Obama. And this year marks the 16th year that Haitian immigrants have been under TPS in the United States. And there is an important aspect in this. Many people who became TPS holder in 2010 have been living in the United States for decades. So now we're talking about, an important segment, an important portion of those TPS holders who have been living in the United States for 20, 25 years, 30 years. And these people, they have never been to Haiti for the past 20, 25, 30 years. So they have families here. They have loans. They bought homes. They have cars. They have access to the credit system. And it's pretty hard to make people understand because of the word temporary, people say, oh, it's easy, just deport them because they knew it was temporary. But it's more complex than that. It's more complex because these people, they have been established here for decades. They have kids who've grown up here. They have never been in touch with Haiti. And the Trump administration decided to end TPS in a specific context because currently the U.S. guns and ammunition have flooded Haiti, and Haiti is under control of heavily armed gangs. And those armed gangs are able to control the country because of the lack, the loose gun policy here in the United States, which is a huge political problem in the United States. So based on my experience covering immigration here, the Caribbean people, I've seen how hard it is for the American audience to understand many people who migrate to the United States, they don't have a choice because, for example, I'm from Haiti, I'm from the Caribbean. I can tell you when it's -3, even when it's, I don't know, let's say 10 degrees, it's not something that is enjoyable to me, because I come from a beautiful, sunny Caribbean country with blue sea, with, trees, nice, beautiful landscape. But people, most of the time, they don't have a choice because they have to leave their country. And we've seen this for the past 5 years. For example, when the gangs took control of the capital, Port-au-Prince, in Haiti, and hundreds of thousands of people have fled their homes. So these people now, they come under special parole program launched by Joe Biden in 2023, the CHNV parole program. And many of these people were under CHNV. They applied for temporary protected status as well. So we are in a situation where Haiti is under control of the gangs, and the Trump administration wants to deport hundreds of thousands of these people. So now the situation is harder because, up until now, those TPS holders, they don't know what the outcome might be. Because, another court may say, listen, you can deport these people. And as you know, there's a need from that administration to show to, the Trump base that, this is the promise, I promised to deport to the largest deportation in U.S. history. And it's about Haitians, they are Black, they're, poor, they're everything. So this is what we're promised. So now to end, I've reported many stories of fear because, I've frankly seen people who really, really don't know what will they do. I've reported the stories of people who simply rely on God. And in most of my interviews, when I ask people a question, listen, what is your plan? The plan is, I don't know, God is above everything. And they simply rely on God because if they go back to Port-au-Prince, their home has been destroyed or burned down by the gangs or whatever. And, even the airport, the international airport is not functioning. So it's a pretty tough situation. And up until now, I can see in different Caribbean communities, especially in Flatbush and Crown Heights area, where we have strong concentration in Carnegie, strong concentration of Haitian immigrants. Many people, they don't want to go out out of fear that ICE may arrest them, because there are many ICE agents, across the city, especially in Queens with the Indo-Caribbeans. So far, everything is around fear. It's about uncertainty, and people heavily rely on the hope that maybe this administration will change its policy and consider those TPS holders to stay longer in the United States.
You raised a really important point, and it's most obvious about Haiti, and certainly Venezuela, but it applies in the other countries as well, where that the very idea of temporary protected of the TPS as a humanitarian status was tied not specifically to individuals, but to the situation where they were coming from. And we know that the situation in Haiti is in certain ways worse now than simply right after the earthquake.
Sure.
And so, there is a deeply disingenuous way that the system itself, as it is being turned on its head when you divorce TPS from the completely from the situation, right? So there's two questions. There's one, what do you do when people have been living in a place for decades? They are members of a community, and so they may not have citizenship, but I would say, right, they may not be American citizens, but those that live here are just as much of a New Yorker as I am. Right? They've been here. But, right, so that's one column, like that's one issue. The other is when you take what is supposed to be kind of humanitarian law, like, right, or humanitarian categories, and you divorce them from the situation where people are coming from, right? And so it's as if we no longer care that what the situation is where people were fleeing. We no longer care what the situation is in Haiti. We no longer care what the situation might be for particular communities in Nepal or elsewhere, which seems to me to tie into something else, which is in a sense a manipulation of law itself, a manipulation of categories themselves. And so we're seeing this as if we no longer have to, even have any reference to what the situation people are fleeing is, whether it be asylum or TPS. But I want to, right, this connects to asylum, and we're seeing it where due process and the asylum seeking process is being manipulated so that it no longer seems to matter, right? Like legal categories no longer seem to matter. We're seeing this with immigration checks, where people are showing up as they're told to, following all the steps they're supposed to follow, and they're detained from outside. Perhaps we saw this during the campaign, in which Brad Lander was accompanying someone and he got arrested. We saw in San Diego where the bishop and a bunch of faith leaders, surprisingly, they did not in San Diego try and arrest the faith leaders. But we're seeing where there's a move for accompaniment because people are doing what it is that they're told to do in the legal process. And it's being manipulated as a way to get them. And we're seeing DOJ just dismiss asylum cases without any reference to what's supposed to happen. And so it's as if their status is just wiped away. And so there is a sense, and I'm going to turn first to Mario here. How do we understand what's happening with due process and trying, right? Like in and of itself, right? How are people supposed to even trust following the steps that they were given? It seems like the very things that should alleviate some fears now just add on more because there's no, you can't go for your check-in without fear. You can't go for your asylum hearing without fear. Where has due process gone?
Well, Megan, I think your question sort of implies the answer to some extent. And, I'll just sort of state the obvious, which is, it's a time of great peril. Without even sort of entering, in a sense, the architectural weeds of your question, but just simply, are the constitutional guardrails working? Is there a sense of regard for, in this sense, law and order, which is a faith-based suspension of disbelief exercise where people agree to what the rules are and abide by them? It's probably no accident that judges wear black robes, because there was a feeling, I think, always that a pronouncement from a court has a magical effect, right? There's no army of the court to enforce any order. So it really is dependent on a voluntary kind of agreement there. And I think we are seeing, probably from a perspective of great anxiety about kind of how easily and how thin the kind of protection of consent is over this exercise and the experiment of, I guess, the American Republic. At a practical level, yes, I mean, I think it's clear that in some ways this administration is incredibly committed to legalisms, and in another sense is incredibly committed to disregarding them. So, they'll rewrite the rules about why and when an application for asylum can be now dismissed, whole cloth, wholesale, without more. Is it because the person didn't pay their fee on time or in the right way, or renew the fee? Now there's a renewed yearly fee for asylum. Is it because they put not applicable in a box, and so the whole thing gets rejected? Is it because the certificate of service is incomplete, or because there are not enough copies made of every single passport page, even though 20 pages are blank? These are the things that are now enabling them to say, well, technically speaking, and I'll say legally, this application was incomplete, therefore we're dismissing and the judges to terminate the case. What's particularly problematic, kind of as a due process concept, and this, I felt every day for 25 years that I went to court, is that the immigration judges are employed by the same people who are prosecuting the case, right? Both the immigration judges and the prosecutors are under the Department of Justice. So they are both getting instructions, orders, threats, right? Performance measures, expected outcomes, dashboards that they have to use and apply on case productivity and solution and resolution. So these are all pressures that affect directly and indirectly how these cases are kind of quote unquote managed and processed with due process. Due process comes out of the 14th Amendment, right, and is applicable in civil proceedings, which is what immigration proceedings are. So I do think that we're in a time of great peril. And the problem is, and I think this is a greater problem, is even that to the extent that the courts can and sometimes do say the right thing in these cases. We see them in courts in Washington, D.C., as Ralph was mentioning, and elsewhere in the nation, right? Judges that are saying this is not right, this is illegal, this violates the Constitution. Well, the administration can appeal at one level and then a next level. And what it does is during that time of pendency of the appeal continues the practice. So there are two things that I see that have an effect on due process that are important to note. One is people's lives continue to be taken apart because the administration continues to do the thing that it's not supposed to do, pending review. Now, TPS in this case is held in place, right? The second thing, though, is that there's always a leveraging of detention as a backstop against due process. And let me explain what I mean by that. And I think we're going to see an explosion of that in this year. $170 billion have been earmarked and given to DHS to spend how it wants. 42 and now another 2.5 billion, so 44.5 billion have been allocated for the construction of detention centers. Why? Is it because the administration thinks it's good to detain people? No, not because it wants to detain them, but because it uses detention as a way to leverage against due process. Every client I ever worked with in detention was okay for that first 3 to 6 months that it took to do the case in detention. But if the case had to go on appeal for another 3, 6, 9, 10, 18 months, they said, I'm out. I can't do this. I need to work. I need to support my family. So the tension is going to be leveraged as a way of nullifying due process so that cases that are now in the courts, which might get bumped out of the courts and into the detention facilities where people can't find a lawyer, those people are going to make decisions that they can't prosecute, they can't hold on, they can't do their case from detention, and will just give up. And I think that's what we're going to see as even a more painful phenomenon of leveraging kind of a non-legal reality, detention and separation, as a way of people to forfeit and give up their due process, in a sense, rights, however minimal those already are, and however hard they are to express, because of course people in immigration proceedings have a right to an attorney, but not one paid at government expense, right? So if you're from New York and you're transferred to Dilley, Texas, how do you get a lawyer there? And so that's even the philosophy behind creating detention facilities in these remote areas. So, I think your question is very real. There's been a diminishment of the core of judges. Certainly those that were sort of liberal leaning have been thrown off their jobs. They're going to bring military judges to replace some of those that have been dismissed and boost up, theoretically a little bit of that. But again, I think it's really fig leaf stuff that's done to give the sense that there is a process that is due, that's being respected. But in fact, these are going to be fast tracked, rubber stamped, and for the most part, just dismissed without more. So when you look at cases of people who are in TPS and may need to jump into the asylum process, people with humanitarian parole who now need to go into the asylum system, they will have their cases heard by this core of judges that's been diminished, reconfigured, and repurposed with some of the military folks who will come in and probably make a whole set of other decisions ordered so by the executive branch. It's just
Well, and that's part of the fear. And I am in no way maligning the, JAG Corps lawyers or judges or anything, but right, I think the logic behind the shift is these are right, the military follows order, right? Like the idea as if they're going to be easier to instruct and control, and because they will follow orders. Saring, in this process, as we think of, right, you mentioned you've been doing a lot more know your rights training, but how are community members mobilizing, right? Some of it, is likely they're accompanying people to things. But what are you seeing in terms of cooperation and organizing so that people don't feel alone, within, you know, there's no way to not feel fear. I mean, because the fear is legitimate and real. But is your community organizing and Adhikar organizing to bring people together so that they feel accompanied?
Yeah, I mean, things are changing day to day, right? There's like new things that happen even when we talk to legal service providers, like they themselves are navigating how to protect because every day a new law comes in place, a new policy comes in place. So I think for us, where we see like the most value is really being able to organize people to connect to their neighborhoods, connect to their local groups, right? I feel like that's where we've kind of stayed focused, where we want to build the rapid response networks within their local neighborhoods and communities. So in time of like need and detention or whatever happens, right, where there's a raid, that the community is able to support each other. So that's where we've been trying to build out like an ICE Watch network. We've been trying to connect with rapid response networks. So something that's coming up for if you guys want to tap into, right, there's a rapid response training that's happening in Woodside on February 19. So there's every week there's things that are happening that we want to connect people to. We also have membership groups where we do a lot of like, if people have any questions, they can reach out to us immediately. We have membership engagement where people can come up and like, we just did one and like immigration updates and policies in the local policy that they can tap into as well. So locally right now, one of the things that we are trying to connect our members to, right, is New York for All, which is a policy that is trying to stop collusion between ICE and local law enforcement, as well as access to representation, which is one thing that has been very hard because as like, there are public defenders in the criminal justice court. There's nothing for immigration court. And as we're seeing increased number of detentions, we see a need for there to be public advocates even within the immigration system. And that's where they'll be able to kind of support the people who are in the detention centers because with that's where we're seeing a lot of a gap where there aren't like legal service providers connection to people who get detained. There's a big gap in being able to kind of connect that. And because that doesn't happen properly, I think that's where the cases get delayed or they don't get proper representation, right? So we are trying to connect and organize people to also connect to these like local policies that they can tap into and also be advocates for. So that's what we're doing day to day right now, really trying to make sure that people have the space and they can come to us in times of need. I mean, as we were talking, we just had like our membership group just kind of went on and became active because I think there was a decision that was made in the court about there's a for the litigation from Nepal, there's appeals happening to reverse the decision that happened in the district court. So I think a decision came out. I don't know what happened. I'm just so these are things that this is how we kind of stay connected and trying to make sure that there's a space if people want to come and be connected to any advocacy efforts. We also have like, when we do members of Congress, we're going to be doing calls to members of Congress, like a call to action that they can tap into as well. So we're making sure that every week there's a space that people can tap into so that they're not in isolation. Because right now, the biggest thing that people can kind of face is being in isolation and having to deal with things by themselves, which is not something that we want to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, thank you. And as you note, right, you're never off, right? Like and this is a broader question. But it's also when you don't want people to feel isolated, but you also have to all of you to get everyone together. How do we kind of maintain some sense of not kind of just being overwhelmed by the kind of the constant barrage of it, which particularly for those who are vulnerable, the constant fear and trying to navigate like everything's constantly changing on you every day. You don't know what to expect, and that erodes at people's sense their dignity, quite frankly. It Ralph, how do you see in your reporting, how do you see communities within themselves? How are immigrants within themselves finding ways to provide mutual support, and accompaniment and kind of share information, when they don't feel that right, like they can't get it from the big mainstream media, and they don't always know where and who and what can be trusted. How are you seeing how are immigrant communities in New York City documenting what's happening and providing support for each other?
Well, I think Searing mentioned the fact that every day there's a new policy. And because of this, people tend to get lost in everything happening with all the new federal policies, the fake news, and especially on social media, Documented has extensively reported how fake news circulating on platforms like TikTok, for example, have impacted immigrant communities. So let me first talk about our strategy at Documented, which is kind of impactful because remember, Documented publishes in 4 different languages, but doing stories, and not only we do story, we produce immigrant story, classic reporting, but we also produce a lot of guides for immigrants, because there's one thing when someone arrived in the United States, in New York, for example, the first thing these people have to deal with is the language barrier. How do they have access to information, what they're looking for in the language they understand? So that's why Documented publish information in 4 different languages: Spanish, Chinese, Haitian, Creole, and English. And then we have dedicated platform for each community. For example, Documented is on WeChat to serve the Chinese community. Documented is on WhatsApp with I think we have WhatsApp with over 6,000 Latino immigrants. And we are also on Nextdoor, and we have our newsletter, Early Arrival. Not only that, for the past, let's say, year and a half, we had a very interesting partnership with the international rescue community, where we create a special platform, documented.info, where immigrants can ask questions directly to us via WhatsApp, via Messenger, via Instagram, or via email. And whatever information they're looking for, whatever resource they're looking for in New York, and we connect these people with those resources with the expert voices. So, and we also have our community participation, because we print content with QR codes, we print guides, and we go to different community events, and we hand those information to immigrants to let them know, listen, there's that platform for you. Whenever you have question, you can ask that question in your language, and Documented will go, go to look for that information and bring it back to you. So this is one of the strategy. And we've seen also that, especially on WhatsApp, those immigrants use WhatsApp a lot to share the different stories. And the thing is with the legacy media, and if you see the reporting is always about ICE raids, about the new policy, but the immigrants, they have deeper question. How does this impact me? What should I do now? And this is exactly the type of responses Documented brings through its guides and through the kind of stories that we're producing.
Thank you. The biggest thing in so many ways is making sure that those who need information can get information that is accurate. Because there's so much misinformation that places migrants at risk because it tells them the wrong thing. But there's also so much manipulative information that may have an element of something that is true, but the way in which it is framed is completely outside of and it has been interesting that the legacy right, there's very little coverage of any actions inside New York City by ICE and Department of Homeland Security outside of what happens at Federal Plaza, what happens at the courthouse, right? So you get coverage of people being picked up outside of court and the asylum hearings, but you're not hearing, right? And I know it from, again, WhatsApp groups that both you and Saring local WhatsApp groups that both you and Saring were talking about. in particular, increased actions outside of Home Depots, including because we are at St. John's, right? We are St. John's. At 168th Street, the Home Depot in Jamaica, that is just down the road from St. John's University. It's not very far. For years, I would drive past it on my way to work, and I would see the day laborers outside waiting for various construction jobs, and landscaping jobs and things, again, things where you would get right connect with Home Depot. Um, and so there is this, it's interesting, right, that because the fuller stories just aren't being told by the legacy media. There's just very little attention to what's other than what's coming and being shared among local communities. And this is where in the last week or so, I've seen um, discussions where people want to act, but well-meaning action can make the situation worse as opposed to better. And this is right in particular with Home Depots. There's been among many of the in the Queens area discussions about our various actions that impact Home Depot. Will that help or will that hurt, make more vulnerable the people outside of Home Depot who are at risk in that area? And one of the things I want to do in the few minutes we have left is to ask each of you to share, for students who will watch this video and for the faculty and staff and students who are on, what do you think is one thing they can do or one place that you think they should go to learn more and to learn how safely and, properly to get involved with some local action and local allyship and accompaniment with those who are vulnerable, where they can be neighbors, as opposed to risking kind of doing something that might make it worse, or where you say something but you don't really know what you're talking about. So I'll start with Saring. What is one recommendation you would give for students and faculty at St. John's who might be interested in being more active on behalf of migrants? And then I'll go to Ralph and then Mari.
Yeah, I would say connect to Hands Off NYC, because they've been one of the leading partners that's been doing a lot of rapid response trainings around different neighborhoods. And then another org I would say connect to would be following NYIC, so New York Immigration Coalition, because they do lead a lot of policy advocacy that is related to immigrant rights justice movement. So those are the not one, but two recommendations I'll give.
I want to add too, where would you recommend that students who are themselves vulnerable? Or is it the same groups, or is there anywhere else you would recommend that if it's a student who's worried or worried about their family?
Yeah, I would say NYIC definitely because they have a lot of resources on know your rights, on safety planning for yourself, right? I mean, if there is support that is needed, I think they also have list of organizations that are in different neighborhood that can support you with that. I mean, if you are Nepali speaking, come to Adhikar. We would love to kind of support you throughout the process. We've been doing like not just know your rights, but also safety planning with folks that might be vulnerable. So yeah, so I would say NYIC, Hands of New York is more around like community action. If you want to take, and I know that there's a lot of local council members, right? And assembly members and senators that have also been very on the ground, depending on where you are, obviously. So if you are in Queens, I would say a lot of offices have been partnering with CBOs to be able to do these type of work. So I would also kind of check in to see what your representatives are doing.
It's always good to know, right, what they're doing because they're doing it on your behalf. Ralph, where would you suggest students go for more information or to get more involved?
Documentedny.com. So it's not It's not because I'm working on documented. It's because, frankly, if you go to documented on the website, we have hundreds of guides. And in those guides, you will find references to every organizations in New York working at different level with immigrants. And there is also something that is really interesting on the website, whatever is happening in the city, if there are resources related to it, for example, where people should find relief, pertaining to deportation, where will they find pro bono legal assistance? If you go to documentedny.com, there are many, many resources. We have hundreds of resources in different languages. And also, if they have specific questions, they can go to documented.info and they can ask questions directly, and the responses will come from immigration attorneys, expert, and we will connect them as well with resources. And there is something that is really important for me as a reporter, because we understand how the counter narrative is really important, because I think in that specific situation, truth is really important. I think we need to tell people, to explain people exactly what the situation is, what is the reality of immigrants. This is really important. And then the last thing is to subscribe to our newsletter, Early Arrival. If you go to our website, you will find the button to subscribe to the newsletter. Hence, you will stay informed with the latest news about immigration. So there are hundreds of organizations in New York City doing a very wonderful work with immigrants. And whenever people need to connect with them, Documented is the go-to source to have access to this organization and to know about the work they're doing.
I would also add that those who want to learn more about the various immigrant communities here in New York City, or who may be trying to break through in getting other people to understand that these images and stereotypes are not real. Documented has I spent a lot of time preparing for this webinar on your website and reading wonderful stories, profiles about people in Queens, who are advocating for clean environment in their community, that have built businesses, and so the positive stories and profiles are another real asset that Documented brings to the table. Mario, we're at St. John's, and while it hasn't been the focus of the webinar, part of why we're running this webinar is the fact that the dignity of everyone, in particular, a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, which in a very real sense are migrants in our community, is central to the Catholic social teaching and the Catholic faith. Can I ask you to, if any of our students are looking to learn more about what the Catholic community in New York is doing and possibly get involved more in Catholic advocacy and accompaniment for migrants, where would you suggest they go?
So a couple of things. And I want to first say that the question you asked first, I think, is answered perfectly by Tsering and Ralph. I think the moment now requires two things. One is support on the ground, which is what Tsering's organizations and those like hers do. It's a time of protection, a time of support, a time of defense. And then what Ralph is doing, which is telling the story. So the movement, I think, now has those two features to it, which I think are critical. And when we talk about anything, I think these days we're talking precisely what those two are doing. So I would say what Tsering and Ralph said is key and critical on all levels, whether it's in New York or Minneapolis or wherever else. I think that your question, I'm going to sort of answer it by adding another element to my answer, which is, we are now working with leadership. And I think Tsering's work and Ralph's work is another way of saying, how do we get leaders to speak into this space more at this time? And I'll say perhaps Catholic leaders, right? So when students or faculty are thinking about what can we do, where do we go, whom do we ask, where do we raise our voice, and whom do we want to kind of shake other than ourselves? And I think students need to become informed and, in a sense, weaponized with the facts so that they can hold a conversation at the Thanksgiving table when they're challenged with, but they came in illegally. How does a student answer that? You got to be ready. Can't just be mercy and compassion. You got to do better than that, right? You got to understand how some of these are fig leaves for other arguments and make the connection so that it doesn't devolve, because there is a 67% who want to deport, but there's a 64% who want to give a pathway to citizenship. So I think a student needs to become fluent in that to be able to touch both ideas and not just operate from pure instinct. But at the same time, again, leadership is important. So there are a couple of programs that are happening kind of at the national level and at the local level. The United States Catholic Conference of Bishops has a program called You Are Not Alone, which they can look up under USCCB/MRS, Migration and Refugee Services. There's a faith initiative coming out of the Faith in Action movement that is looking to mobilize Catholics in this time between Ash Wednesday and Corpus Christi in June, right? Vigils, rosaries, prayer services that will be mobilized and engaged throughout the country, including New York. I know there's stuff happening in Newark, for instance, next week. I know that I'm going to a meeting of all the parishes in Brooklyn, Queens, at the seminary in Douglaston this week to sort of begin to talk about how can parishes do more. So students, I think, should be able to sort of say, I want to go to my parish priest and say, what are you doing? What are we doing? We are the church. I am a parishioner and the church. What are we doing? And there are people in the pews who want to do stuff, but don't know how. So find those conversations, ask the questions. Is it a social justice ministry? Is it a migrant ministry? Is it another ministry that needs to maybe have that meeting with the parish priest who may be waiting for that conversation? This is the moment to do it, to push into that middle management leadership. Look, in New York, we have a new cardinal. I think we're feeling pretty good about what he might say, he might do. Can you do it next week? Hard to say, but that's another point at which the pressure can push to get language and statements which do make a difference. I think we saw that the bishop's statement made a difference already. We at Center for Migration Studies are working on an initiative called Impact, Immigrant Prophetic Action Project, where we are going into different regions and meeting with the diocese and the leadership there to do kind of what I was just talking about, to get those parishes and those programs that want to do more in conversation with leadership. We did it in Providence, Rhode Island. We're going to do it in El Paso, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, Washington State, Detroit, Ohio, and other places throughout 2026. I can send you more information. You can see it on our website at cmsny.org. But again, I think a space to work with is leadership and the Thanksgiving table.
Thank you very much. I want to express my deep gratitude to Ralph, Tsering, and Mario for sharing with us this evening. Thank you to those who attended and to those who will watch this when it goes up on YouTube. And again, it's prayer and action. So we began with prayer, and I hope everyone who watches this webinar will take one step to learn more and do more on behalf of our neighbors. Everybody, thank you for joining us this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.